Hi, welcome back to YTV and Everybody Has a Story. We hope you had a good break and a good new year. 2014 is over, but the repercussions of all that happened last year continue to reverberate, from the protests in Ferguson, Missouri over the shooting of Michael Brown, to the killing of unarmed 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, to the death of 43-year-old Eric Gardner at the hands of police in Staten Island. Here to talk with us about these events and their impact on race relations today is Yale historian Crystal Feimster. Feimster is an assistant professor of African American Studies and American Studies and is the author of the book Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching. Professor Feimster, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Cody.
So you are a historian of the civil rights era. You've examined movements and marches and protests. Is what happened in Ferguson a singular moment, or could this be the start of a renewed civil rights movement?
That's a really good question, Cody. And the historian in me will answer it one way, and the kind of optimist activist would probably answer it another way. In terms of the question of whether it's a singular act, you're a history major, right? So we know that the past is always relevant, right? We understand context is important. Could this have happened anywhere in the country? Possibly, but there's something particular about Ferguson and that particular community that sort of set a powder keg off, right? It had national reverberation, and I think that has to do with the sort of particular history of Ferguson, the longer history of police violence and police brutality and the impact on young African American men in particular. So in that sense, I think it's no coincidence that this happened in '64 when we think about the long civil rights movement. Did I say '64? I meant to say 2014. That we're at this sort of 50th anniversary of like the Freedom Summer, when young students took to the streets in protest, went down south to Mississippi, and I think that anybody that's aware of the sort of longer narrative of civil rights understands that this moment is being informed by that history. I would like to, as an activist and as someone who's committed to the civil rights movement, I would really like to see this as the start of a new movement. And I think that we see that in many ways, particularly as this has sort of taken off in other places, in other cities. But I also think part of that energy has to do with context again. That we see it taking off in the Northeast because something happened in New York that felt very familiar and very similar. So that's my answer in terms of answering it as a historian and then answering it as somebody who wants to be optimistic about what comes next.
Well, you talked a little bit about the history of Ferguson, what that may have contributed, but the response to Michael Brown and the shooting of Trayvon Martin 2 years ago was overwhelming, the national attention. But this is happening every day, and we see cases with Tamir Rice, with John Crawford. What characteristics do you think give certain cases more fuel than others?
I mean, I think it's this way that the story gets told, right? Because we know that there are hundreds and hundreds of other cases, right? But there's some stories that feel more compelling, right? That they move people and motivate people in particular ways, right? And how stories get told now, sort of in our world of media and texting and blogging, makes a difference. And I think in both of these cases, in the case of Ferguson, you had people with cameras out there. The fact that his body was left out in the street for hours provoked a response in people, regardless of what they understood to be the facts, what people didn't know for a long time. We didn't know a lot of the facts. But the sort of visceral, immediate story that came out was one that made it hard to ignore this case. And the same on Staten Island, those images of Michael Garner saying, "I can't breathe," that in some ways both of these cases tapped into something that is a national narrative. In both of those cases, there were people who spoke about the implications of the cases. So for the Brown case, his mother was a very vocal person in the protest, and she was tapping into a longer narrative about black mothers speaking out about the killing of their children. People were able to play to, in the New York case, he was a father of, I don't know, I can't even remember how many kids he had, but maybe 5? So that people were able to feel the impact because there was something, regardless of what you believe happened in those incidents, there was something about those stories and the way that they were being told that inspired people to protest, to go out into the streets. At the same time that we have great stories coming out about these cases, we have people who are organized and ready to take to the streets and mobilize around these cases, that they're watching the news, waiting for the ideal case. And that's something that's been a long strategic part of the civil rights movement, whether the NAACP was going to take up Claudette Colvin's case versus Rosa Parks, that people are being strategic about which stories to put forward.
We're talking about telling the story of the civil rights movement. Julian Bond, who helped found a student nonviolent coordinating committee, he's been going to events and giving speeches, and one study he likes to cite is where they polled thousands of high school students, and they asked them, what do you know about the civil rights movement? They knew 4 words and 2 names, I Have a Dream, and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Clearly, a lot of textbooks and media either get things wrong about the civil rights movement or they're too narrowly focused. What's important about getting that narrative right, other than just for sake of truth, but for sake of activism?
Right. I think there is a reason, of course, why young students know about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and the bus boycott. It was a huge triumph. Martin Luther King comes out of the bus boycott as the leader of a movement that has been spinning its wheels for 2 decades, right? There is this charismatic leader. And, even my son came home this week with a homework assignment, and it was about Martin Luther King. And I think there are many stories that we can tell. And I don't think the story of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks does a disservice to the movement. I think it's an entry point, right? If students have that as their entry point, it's a great place for me to sort of enter in and say, well, how do we think about what they accomplished? And who were the people walking? Who were the people walking to work day in and day out, right? They were working class black women, domestic servants, that they sustained the movement, that we can't understand the civil rights movement without understanding the ordinary people or the people on the ground doing that work. So there are moments when I sigh and I'm like, Martin Luther King, but I adore Martin Luther King, and I am, as an African American person, grateful for his narrative, and that we have all of these narratives of great men in our history, and of course I would like to problematize that, but I think why not put Martin Luther King in the mix? In terms of how we think about it, as a strategy, if we think about history as a strategy for informing the next generation of activists, it's a way to get students to think about leadership and what that looks like and the pressure on someone who's leading a movement. Also gets them to think about how they might organize differently. And that I think what Julian Bond, for example, offers up as a leader and a member of SNCC is that there are very different ways to organize a movement. And SNCC was more interested in participatory democracy, that we see a shift by the end, there is a sort of cult of leadership in Stokely Carmichael and folks like that. But at the beginning, they were really committed to being a group that was not hierarchical. That changes sometimes, but.
Well, you talk about leadership. I mean, one of the things that has struck me is when you look at No Justice, No Peace, you look at the climate march in New York, there's not really a clear leader to a lot of these movements, like we see in the narratives from the early civil rights movement. Is that a good thing?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, people are down on Oprah Winfrey right now, and I know if you heard, she made a comment about the problem is that there's no leadership. There's no leadership, right? And, I'm a huge fan of Ella Baker, who argue that if a movement is dependent on a single leader, that when that leader is assassinated, in the case of so many of the civil rights leaders of the 60s, the 50s and 60s, then the movement loses something, right? And that the people believe that they have to be led, right? That change can't come from the community, that their people are waiting to hear what they need to do, what the issues are. And if we've learned anything from SNCC or from even the Highlander School, where the argument is that people know what they're up against and that they have to decide how to enact change. So on the one hand, as someone who understands how authority works, how organizations work, that you often need somebody in those leadership positions, I'm not necessarily convinced that change has to be led, that change comes from strong leadership. And we know historically that the civil rights movement was successful when 4 boys sat at a counter in Greensboro and sparked a movement, right? There was no leadership. There was nobody saying, okay, we're going to do this in every city. But it provoked change, that people had to respond. They didn't have to respond to Martin Luther King. They had to respond to those people sitting in on those counters. So no, I don't think it's a bad thing. That's the long answer to your question.
Well, continuing on movements and marches, there was a march about Michael Brown and Ferguson here in New Haven back in August.
Right.
And there was a point where the group got to the New Haven Green and they said, hands up, don't shoot. And people put their hands up, but you had some white participants putting their hands up and some choosing not to put their hands up. And there seemed to be some confusion about what to do, whether to show solidarity or show that these people could never possibly understand what it's like to face that threat. What does appropriate and effective white alliance and participation look like in these movements?
In the question, you put out 2 terms. One, alliance, one is solidarity. I always push my students to think in terms of solidarity versus ally or alliance. And one of the reasons is I think that when we think in terms of allies, it's easier to say, okay, here are these people with this problem, and how can I help? How can I be a support? And when we think in terms of solidarity, we think this is about a problem that affects us all, right? So that if we understand that if a black boy is shot down in the street, an unarmed black boy is shot down in the street, that's not just about black people, right? And that's not to undermine the hashtag Black Lives Matter. That's articulating something different. But I also think that it matters to white people if unarmed citizens can be gunned down, because it makes you vulnerable. My students know I love Lonnie Guarnier's quote, the canary in the mine, where she argues that black people are the canaries in the mine, and that image is that before miners go down into the mine, they send a canary in to see if the air is tolerable. If the canary comes out, then it's a safe space that everybody can go in. If the canary doesn't come out, the air is toxic, the canaries die. And I believe that what's bad for black people is bad for white people. It's bad for all of our citizens if we can't trust that the police will not shoot us down in a moment of terror, right? So I think the white people should put their hands up as well and say, don't shoot, because then it's everybody's problem.
Well, the police officers that shot Tamir Rice in Cleveland, after the shooting, they radioed in, quote, shots fired, male down, black male, maybe 20, end quote. Tamir Rice was 12 years old. How are they mistaking a 12-year-old and seeing that he's 20?
I mean, Glenda Gilmore is probably as good at answering this question as me. She wrote an article once called "The Black Incubus." I think that's the word she used. It's this, that there is this fear of the black body, right? And so that in certain contexts, when white people are afraid, they draw on these longer narratives that demonize black people, that make black boys into men, that make black teenagers into superhuman beasts, right? So we have that in the Michael Brown case. So, he's not being taken out by 12 bullets. He's still coming at Derek, is that the police officer? Darren Wilson. So that I think there is something in our culture, this sort of longer history coming out of slavery, where we're always trying to justify certain kinds of brutality against black people by demonizing them, that they become monsters, right? And so I don't doubt that when those police officers pulled up, that in their minds they saw a 20-year-old, because they have an image of what crime looks like, who has a gun, who doesn't, and it tends to be a black man between the ages of 18 and 45, right? Not 12.
Well, speaking of drawing on longer narratives, Douglas Blackman won the Pulitzer Prize for a book about Jim Crow called Slavery by Another Name. Michelle Alexander wrote a book that got a lot of attention about mass incarceration called The New Jim Crow, and many writers and activists have called the shootings of unarmed black men the new lynchings of today.
Right.
What influence do you think it has to use these terms from former eras and use these historical analogies?
I mean, I think it's useful. It has its limits, right? That we all have an understanding of what lynching is, right? Those of us who are historians, myself, who I've written a book about lynching, I understand that extralegal violence supported state-sanctioned violence, right? So that many of the cases of lynchings in the 19th century had to do with black people challenging police violence and police authority. So that in some ways you can see that this is a longer narrative. Yes, I could say this is a modern day lynching, but it doesn't really capture all the nuances of this particular moment, right? Particularly when our police force looks very different from Jim Crow South, right? Where those police officers were always white, right? I mean, we can see even in the case of New York, right? So in this recent sort of catastrophe where the two police officers who are now part of this larger narrative were not white men, right? We had an Asian man and I think a Latino woman, right, that were murdered. So the analogy doesn't carry completely, right? That the police force that we understand is not this sort of completely embodied by white male bodies. So it doesn't always work, but I think there's some power and some use in using those metaphors and analogies.
Lastly, you gave the keynote address at the Norwalk Human Rights Day event last month, and you talked a little bit about the future of the civil rights movement. Trying to read the tea leaves a little bit, what does that future look like, and what role can students at Yale and other universities try to play in it?
I want to be optimistic about the future. At the same time, I know that progress is slow, that it does not come without fights. It does not come without losses. And that people are going to continue to have to put their bodies on the line, right? And then we will take some steps back. I like to think of the Obama moment as a step forward. But I've also understood that in the 8 years that he's held office, that we've gone back in some ways, that we've gotten lazy in the way that we think about race and how racism functions, because we've been able to sort of say, oh, look, we have a black president, we are so advanced, look how far we've come, when in fact we have such a long way to go. And critical race theorists argue that racism is insolvable, that it is going to be here forever. So the question is, how do we inch towards a more just society? For me, that means teaching courses where I give students the tools to engage in what I see it's a struggle that's just going to keep moving. The issues might shift, the players might shift, but we're going to constantly be fighting for equal justice and equal rights for our citizens. I don't think we're ever going to get there. I think things can get better, but I also understand history, and things can get bad again, right? So what can Yale students do? What can other students? Some of them can take to the streets. Some can write the stories that make these issues relevant and important and inspire people to fight for justice and to fight for change, right? People have to get comfortable talking about race. That's what I do in my courses. You got to be prepared to say the stupid thing and have somebody say you're an idiot. That we have to have these conversations. And again, that's why, for me, the teaching is really important. That it's not just about having folks up on a panel saying, this is what you should do, this is what you should be thinking about, but that we are going to engage in a conversation with the students in these breakout groups where we get them to think about what tools, what gifts do they have to bring to bear, what are the stakes for them, what are the stakes for the communities that they have to go back to, whether that's in Cincinnati, Ohio, or New York, what can they take from Yale, from our courses, from the teaching, to change their communities for the better. And it's hard work, and it's slow.
Crystal Feimster, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Cody. It was a pleasure.
And as always, thank you for joining us for YTV. This has been Everybody Has a Story. I'm Cody Pomerantz. See you next time.